Guys, I am so excited to today be continuing our theme for November 2020 on food. We have had some incredible episodes. Our past two on food sensitivities, the number one lie about food that I hate, and how to regain trust in food again, even when it has caused you to lose your trust in it. If you have not heard those episodes yet, I would strongly encourage you to go check them out. They are filled with heart and information and hopefully a good dose of encouragement. But today I'm having a very special guest, Whitney Morgan, onto the Better Belly podcast. Whitney is a founder of Morgan Nutrition, and she is the creator of the Gluten Gauntlet System, a system to help you go gluten-free in 5 weeks or less. She is a gluten-free warrior and a fierce functional health coach. She helps women repair the damage that years of gluten exposure have done to their health. And in almost a decade of working with gluten-sensitive and celiac clients, Whitney has seen firsthand that reversing and even healing your gluten-related disorders requires much more than just not eating gluten. As Whitney likes to say, going gluten-free is like putting out the fire when your house is burning down. It's the obvious first step, but you're left with a whole lot of damage when the smoke clears. I am so excited for you each to get to hear on Whitney's amazing information, her amazing story, and what she has learned about our health system and why you can go 20 years, which is how long Whitney went, before getting a true celiac diagnosis. I know it might sound hard to believe, but you will have to listen in to hear exactly how the doctors missed her celiac disease even after testing. Are you ready to dive in? I hope you are. Let's get going. Welcome to the Better Belly podcast, where we find freedom from food restrictions, we increase energy in our lives, and we begin to feel healthy and vibrant again by finding the root cause of our gut health problems. My name's Allison Jordan, marathon runner, functional medicine practitioner, certified craniosacral therapist, gut health nerd, lover of Jesus, and owner of the Better Belly Therapies, a clinic based in Ann Arbor, Michigan that works with both virtual and local clients to help them achieve the best health of their life. I am here to walk with you on your journey to a better belly and a better life. We're going to go beyond popping a probiotic and checking out our poop. In this show, we are going to go deep into gut transformation strategies that last for life. If you're ready to feel your best, get ready to roll. You are in the right place. Thank you for listening to the Better Belly podcast. Just a reminder, this information is not meant to diagnose, manage, or treat disease. Always consult with your own health practitioner before you make changes. All right, guys. Today we have Whitney Morgan on the Better Belly podcast, and I am so excited to have her on. She has been an instructor to me. She has given me guidance, and I got to meet her through our functional diagnostic nutrition business and just the overall company. As soon as I met her, I thought, she has such a wealth of knowledge. She is a gluten expert. She has an acupuncturist. And Whitney Morgan, welcome to the Better Belly podcast.
Thank you, Allison. I'm so excited to be here. It's so much fun.
Yes. So just to start off for our listeners, can you tell us what do you do and who do you do it for?
Sure. Well, as you said, I'm a licensed acupuncturist, and I do dabble in acupuncture, but mostly I'm a functional nutrition consultant, and I kind of think of myself as a gluten-free warrior. I'm really focused in the gluten-related disorder world, and I work mostly with women who have collected 1, 2, 3 or more autoimmune diseases. And some of them already know that they have a gluten sensitivity or celiac disease kind of at the root, but many of them don't. But that's what I help women to untangle, is to get control of their gluten-related disorder, which is typically autoimmune in nature, and to really dominate their gluten-free life, because there's just so much misinformation out there, and the kind of advice that we get typically from nutritionists and medical doctors just doesn't go far enough. And so that's my passion.
Yeah. I mean, even hearing you re-say all that, and I already know what you do, I just
Mm-hmm.
boggles my mind, because one of the reasons I wanted to have you on the podcast is there's this huge movement of like gluten-free, and like it's cool, and we're kind of noticing gluten, maybe it doesn't make
Right.
us feel as good as we need to, but like you bring such like a depth, like you work with people who already know they have gluten problems, which just tells
Mm-hmm.
me like there must be something more going on other than just
Oh,
like
yeah.
reading labels. And then you work with people who don't know that they have gluten problems. And I've heard you say this before, that there's actually, you can test, like, for example, gluten not sensitive, but wheat sensitive, right?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And that's, I think, where the disconnect is in terms of the traditional paradigm of what we think of as gluten sensitivity or celiac disease, is that it really does stem from celiac disease testing and celiac disease awareness. Now, celiac disease definitely is a gluten-related disorder, but it's very, very specific. It's a singular autoimmune disease that occurs in the gut. But gluten sensitivity can be at the root of so many other pathologies, and there are no gut symptoms whatsoever. And some of those pathologies may not have to deal with gluten specifically, but with the non-gluten parts of wheat. But even our language has become so focused around gluten. Everything is gluten-free, right?
Right.
Well, wheat gets kind of missed in this conversation. And you can have a completely gluten-free food, and it's still not good for that gluten-sensitive person, because most gluten-sensitive people are wheat-sensitive as well, and they're not the same thing. So it's kind of confusing. It takes a little while and a little bit of education to wrap your brain around it.
Right. I'm so glad that you've done that. Yeah, right. I mean, it's not my specialty, which is just so fascinating. There's so much depths and layers. What kind of things drives women? You say you work with a lot of women who end up maybe having multiple autoimmune disorders.
Yeah.
So I'm imagining they already like are aware that they're trying to be healthy, but what are some of the symptoms they are experiencing that drives them to work with you by the
Oh my
time they're
goodness.
with you?
Yeah, I mean, it's a laundry list. And the problem in my business is it's difficult to get your arms around everything, because the symptoms are just so diverse. It could be, joint pain, anything in the joints, anything in the brain. So neurological symptoms, anxiety, depression, bipolar, panic disorders, schizophrenia. I mean, you name it, dementia. And then anything in the joints, the musculoskeletal system, anything in the skin. It's the whole entire body. So infertility is another one, that most people don't
Oh.
think of. So if anyone out there has difficulty getting pregnant or has a history of unexplained miscarriages, one of the first things that they should do is be evaluated for gluten sensitivity, because it's just such a common correlation. But it hasn't really trickled down into the mainstream awareness in the medical community. So the women I work with have a very common experience. They've been to this specialist and that specialist. And so they go see a lot of different practitioners, and they collect different diagnoses along the way, but no one's connecting the dots between all of these things. And that's exactly what happened to me.
Oh,
So
yeah. Tell me more. I actually don't
yeah,
know your story a ton. But I do know you have this. You told me you have this expertise because you went through the fire.
exactly.
So what's your
Yeah.
story?
So let's see, about a year after my daughter was born, I developed psoriasis. And I didn't know what it was at the time, got my diagnosis. They gave me some steroid cream, went on my way. But before that, in my 20s, I started having anxiety attacks and panic attacks in the middle of the night. And of course, that was, okay, well, Xanax, we'll fix that, right? So by the time my daughter is 1, I've got chronic anxiety and panic disorder, and now I have psoriasis. Then I developed Hashimoto's. And then eventually, a few years later, I was diagnosed with interstitial cystitis,
Oh my
which
gosh.
is, for your listeners who don't know, it's an extraordinarily painful bladder autoimmune disease. I mean, you're in pain 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
In your
It's
bladder.
excruciating. In your bladder. I mean, think about it, the worst bladder infection you've ever had.
Right.
If you've
It's
ever
a
had
very
one.
sensitive tissue.
Oh, yes. Magnify that by 10, and it's constant. I
Oh.
mean, constant. So the turning point for me was, and I came from a really traditional medical family. Everyone in my family is doctors and nurses and all of that. So in my family, you don't go to the GP, you go to the specialist, right? You go to the cream of the crop, top dude, and they're the ones who are going to get the job done. So I went to specialist after specialist and then eventually wound up in this urologist's office, and he was the head of the department. And he was the one that gave me my diagnosis of interstitial cystitis. I was sitting in there in his office in my little paper gown, and he says to me, yeah, okay, so nothing can be done. There is no cure. Your pain is going to get worse. We can try to manage that. But you should probably join a support group. And I was like, oh my God, I mean, who says that? So at that moment, it was kind of this wake-up call for me. I mean, literally, Allison, I had this experience where I heard every cell in my body scream, no. I mean, it was like a symphony, it's like hearing voices. And I walked out of that office and I was like, no, I'm sorry. That is not my future. I'm not going to accept that. And that kind of, pushed me off of this path of traditional medicine. And that's when I started to really dive into alternative medicine. And I went to see a naturopath. I started getting acupuncture, changing my diet, doing a lot of my own research. And then I went to acupuncture school. And then when I graduated acupuncture school, I found the functional diagnostic nutrition certification. I did that. And I have to say, it's just transformed my health. I don't have interstitial cystitis anymore. I don't have it.
That's amazing.
And it is amazing because it's almost unheard of. If I went to a doctor today, they say, oh yeah, you still have it. It's just in remission. But no, I can tell you, balls to bones, I do not have it, right? It's not in my body. So it wasn't until after my diagnosis of IC that by a fluke, just because I thought that I might have a little bit of an ulcer or something, I was studying really hard and really stressed out. So I went to see a GI doctor, again, another specialist, and he said, let's just go ahead and do a colonoscopy, endoscopy, and just check you out. I'm sure you're fine.
A lot of our listeners.
Stressed, let's do it.
Right. A lot of our listeners are familiar with those too.
Exactly. And so I woke up from that procedure and he's sitting next to me and he's like, I can't believe it. You have celiac disease. I had never had a GI symptom in my life, Allison, not one day. So I get this diagnosis. And it's like, okay, now all of the pieces start to fall together for me. And I then started going down this path of, let me see the connections between this underlying celiac disease that was silently progressing through my body for decades.
Yeah.
And all of these other diagnoses that I've collected. Is there a connection?
Okay.
Now, my medical doctors said, no, there's no, they're different, right? Different systems, these are completely different things, but they're not. And I've learned that myself, and I've learned it over and over again in my clinical practice with women. They're not different. All of these autoimmune diseases are connected, and they don't all have to be connected to celiac disease, but 95% of the time, they're all connected to the gut.
There's so many questions flowing through my head right now. One of them is, I'm really curious, when you went to see the naturopath, I know they often work with diet. Did they, or even, I don't even care if they suggested it, did you go gluten or wheat free when you were healing yourself in that time period?
No, I didn't get that directive from anybody. What I stumbled upon was a therapeutic diet called the body ecology diet. Are you familiar with that?
No. Tell us.
Okay, well, basically you eliminate, it's got some acid alkaline things to it, but fundamentally the reason why it worked for me is because it did eliminate gluten. There were a couple of grains that were approved, quinoa and millet. Those are the two approved grains, but even then you could only have them in moderation and particular proportions with other foods. So my consumption of grains was reduced by 95%, and I was just coincidentally gluten-free.
Okay, so no one said let's be gluten-free. You actually personally found that diet, like the natural, nobody guided you to it. And then,
Correct.
so you probably would have never put the link together. You knew the diet helped, but you didn't know maybe one particular food might have been really a big factor. And it turned out to be for you wheat or gluten. Because I'm actually really curious now, because we started this whole thing off with gluten versus wheat. Are you gluten and wheat, or are you just gluten?
Yes.
You're gluten and wheat.
I'm gluten sensitive and I'm wheat sensitive. Yeah. I was going to say, I've never seen someone on paper when I run the labs who's not sensitive to both. Right? I mean, if you're gluten sensitive, you're also wheat sensitive.
Okay.
You don't have to be. I'm sure there's some unicorn out there who might not be, but I haven't seen it in my practice.
Oh, I misunderstood that in a conversation we had once. Okay, that's great. Good for our listeners. I mean, it's possible apparently, but then in your experience, which is pretty good at this point, then you usually do see them together. Okay, great.
I have to say though that I have seen women who are sensitive to the non-gluten parts of wheat and to the lectin part of wheat, but not to the gluten parts of wheat.
And you've shared that. So if they are sensitive to gluten, usually it's also the wheat. But if it could just be the lectins and the wheat part, but not the gluten. Okay. And that's not celiac, because celiac specifically gluten, and then it gets missed.
Right. And celiac is specifically an autoimmune reaction in the gut. So when they test you for celiac disease, they're not really testing you for gluten sensitivity. They're testing you for antibodies to transglutaminase 2, endomysial, and maybe deaminated gliadin. But those
these are very fancy words, by the way.
They're very specific to celiac disease. Okay. So in order to catch someone with full-blown celiac disease, someone has to have so much gut damage that they have those antibodies.
Ooh.
Right? Yeah. So it's really possible for people with celiac disease to go undiagnosed even if they get the standard testing.
Yeah. This is super, super interesting. So it sounds like you healed yourself. You were on that diet, and I guess you got off of it. You didn't have the IC come back. Was your psoriasis also better at that point?
The psoriasis definitely got better on that diet. And then, as most of us do with therapeutic diets, we kind of go off of them for a while. And so I noticed other symptoms, coming back. When I shifted off of the body ecology diet, I started getting this pain in my stomach, but very pinpointed pain, which sent me to the GI doc. But in acupuncture school also, I got exposed to the paleo diet. So then I transitioned to the paleo diet, and this was before my diagnosis. And lo and behold, I'm feeling loads better, right? Everything gets better. Well, hello, it's grain-free.
Yes.
Right. So after I got my diagnosis, it was like, oh, okay, totally makes sense why I would feel so much better on those diets, right?
Yeah.
It's very, very interesting. It literally took me from my first panic attack to my diagnosis, I'd say 20 years to get my diagnosis.
And of course, what's amazing is, when you work with someone, how long do you work with them now? Like, what's their healing pathway like?
Yeah.
Maybe average.
Minimum of 3 months.
Okay.
Average is about 8 months, something like that. The goal in my practice is I really want you to be able to take the ball and run with it. I don't want women to need me, right? It's like, I want to give you all the education and the testing, and let's get it together for you, right? So that you can take control, and then you can thrive in your life. And then most women come back to me on an annual basis to run the labs again, because I really believe in that. I think no matter how good your diet is, no matter how vigilant you are, just like anyone with a thyroid issue, they run thyroid labs once a year, right? At least to look at their numbers.
Sure.
Same is true for gluten sensitivity. You have to run those labs once a year just to make sure nothing's sneaking in, to make sure your immune system is still settled down. Yeah.
So you, like, the life that you lived and your vigilance for health and belief in it, you took a 20-year process and have boiled it down for someone for, I know sometimes I work with clients and they're like, how long will it take? You're like, 6 months to a year for healing. 3 months for usually like a significant improvement in how you feel, but you got to continue it for a while to really like sustain it. So the body's like, got it, I'm good.
Right.
And what I always tell my clients is like, it took me about 4 years to figure my stuff out. Now that feels fast compared to 20,
Right. That's
and
right.
so, I mean, your work is just so beautiful. And it's so exciting. And I know that you even have, and we'll talk about this again at the end, but you have basically a mini course on how to have a gluten-free household where you put in all those like sneaky things that I'm sure might be really hard to catch over, like, can share them all right now, but you do have a mini course for anybody who is interested and where you just download all that information.
Right. And Allison, I want to say to your listeners that's so critical, because I can't tell you how many times in my practice I have seen the most vigilant people who are gluten-free. They're doing everything right, and they're ticking all the boxes, but other people in their house are still eating gluten. And when we run the labs, they come back with evidence of contamination. And the thing is that for the most part, these women are feeling a lot better, but they still have lingering symptoms.
Okay.
But they're 100% convinced that they are 100% gluten-free. And then when we find out on paper that they're not, it's really telling, because it shows you the power of even micro exposures, right? And I think for a lot of people, when they're gluten sensitive, I'll hear stuff like, oh, okay, well, every time I eat gluten, I have profuse diarrhea, or I get a migraine, or, so I know when I'm contaminated. Okay, well, that might be for a certain dose of gluten.
Sure.
Right? But the dose makes the poison. So if you get a little crumb that's left on a cutting board, or even something smaller than that, something you couldn't even identify as a crumb. Well, the threshold for that dose, maybe that's not enough to give you that typical trigger that you can sense.
Right.
But it's still doing something to your immune system. So, and right now, I mean, there's no way for any of us to test to see what our personal safety threshold is for parts per million of gluten exposure. But my point with clients is that micro exposures matter, and you don't necessarily know when they happen. That's why we have to look at it on paper and make sure that it's not going on.
What would you suggest, Whitney? Because I know that, like, I work with people with GI stuff, and I work with people with lots of symptoms, and I'm curious from your perspective, like, how often would you run a gluten test on somebody who's having, like, when you said you had a client who, or actually I have, I've had clients with IC, interstitial cystitis or anxiety and stuff. And like, would you just run it at the beginning? Like, cause I'm sure someone's listening and like, they might be freaking out like, oh my gosh, is it the gluten? Or I don't know if I even want to take that test. And what would you say to that listener to, how would you guide someone who's maybe never even considered if it's gluten?
Right. Well, I think no matter where you are, whether you're gluten-free already, or you're still having gluten every once in a while, or you're eating gluten every day, it doesn't really matter. Do the test, because the test is going to orient you. It's like pulling out a map. And if you're lost, right? At least when you pull out that map, you now can orient yourself and figure out where you are, right? Where are you starting from? So I always test people in the beginning. Anyone who works with me gets this test done.
Right. I mean, that's
non-negotiable. Right.
Right.
So now let's say I do run into a unicorn and I do this test and they're perfectly in the green. Everything is fine, right? No reactions whatsoever. Then I'll say once a year, run this. Okay. But most women, all women so far, when I run the test, they are getting some level of exposure. So then we have to do the deep work of where is it coming from, right? Is it, and we have to see, is it IgA exposure, IgG exposure? Is it every day? Is it maybe you got a once in a blue moon thing because you went out to a restaurant? You can kind of start to tell that story when you're looking at these results. I can see whether or not this is probably a daily thing. So you start to investigate.
That's valuable. And
it's super valuable.
Because in some ways it's not even, what I like what you just said is it's not just like getting this test and then just panicking because you're like, oh my gosh, how much gluten am I eating? But because
Right.
they have someone like you who's experienced in looking at this lab test result, you can even sounds like you get a feel for like, actually, like
Yeah.
you're probably not getting it every day. And then you can just probably do this really great guidance, I'm sure is the benefit of working with you, like, and why people should work with professionals. Because I know like
Yeah.
when I was sick, I was kind of like, can't I just find an online diet and follow it myself? Like,
Right. Yeah.
and I love what you just said. Like, that's comforting to me. I mean, I remember my own gut health journey. If someone could have said like, hey, patted me on the back and even said, hey, you're actually doing pretty good, like I would have paid money for that.
Right.
Like,
Absolutely.
and
And
then right, and then guidance, like just look at these 3 places or whatever, you know.
yes. Yes. Like I'll give you an example. Let's say you've got someone who lives in a gluten-free house or thinks they do, but they go out to eat once a month, right? And we run the labs and they've got a lot of antibodies to gluten and to wheat, but they're all IgG antibodies, which are the ones that
Okay.
stick around for a long time, but no IgA antibodies whatsoever. Well, then based on the story they're telling me about their life and what I'm looking at on paper, I can make a pretty good educated guess that that restaurant is a problem for you, you know? So let's do an experiment. You just live in your gluten-free house for the next 3 months. Don't go out to that restaurant or any restaurant. Let's run the lab again. And if
Mm.
you are clean, then we know, yeah, dining out, at least there, wherever you dine out, is not a good idea.
I love
Right?
that. So, and I
Yeah.
don't even know, I bet a lot of our listeners don't know that you have that IgG and then the IgA, that they have different like kind of time capsules,
Yeah. Yeah.
timing on them. And so,
Yeah.
and I know that that's becoming more common terminology. So our listeners might be familiar with those being a huge way that we measure our immune response. But that is less common information, I'm sure. So I'm glad that we shared that. So
Cool.
fun little fact. You've already mentioned, I feel like you've mentioned your own life and you've mentioned some of your other clients, like what they come in with. I'm really curious, like, what are a few of your favorite testimonials of clients you've worked with? Just like either big turnarounds or
Mhm.
just aha moments. I'd love to hear a few.
Well, actually, I'd love to tell you, because it's a little bit longer, one particular story, because
I'm
it's really
ready.
fascinating.
Yes.
So I had a client, let's call her Carolyn. She was a critical care nurse. And so she had a lot of, hands-on jobs she had to do with all of her patients and worked very long hours. And she was having this very debilitating and painful rash all over her hands, kind of eczema like, but a little bit more inflamed and weepy, right? And so, and she had to wash her hands all the time, right, in her job,
Yuck.
which would
Yeah.
make it worse because all the soap and the different, and she had to deal with alcohol and things like that. So she was just a wreck, right?
Ow, ow, ow.
Well, interestingly, she lived for 6 months out of the year in another country, and then 6 months in the U.S. And what she told me is when she went to her country of origin, her home country, everything cleared up and everything was fine. And then when she come back here, boom, right? So I ran all of the tests, and yes, we found that she was highly, highly reactive to wheat and gluten, off the charts immune response, a
Did
lot of
she or did
antibodies.
she already know that?
No,
Okay, so that was new information.
that was new. She didn't have any gastrointestinal complaints whatsoever.
Okay.
So I put her on a very particular detox while we were waiting for these lab results. We didn't make any dietary changes whatsoever. But on this detox, she got like about an 80% clear of her symptoms. So she was really happy. And then when we got the test results back and she shifted to more of a paleo diet, her symptoms went into remission completely, right? And so she was thrilled. But then her question to me was, well, I don't understand that, because when I go, to my home country, I'm eating wheat all the time, right?
Yeah.
But the country that she was going to, very clean, very small, very agricultural, just kind of, not an American experience,
And by
right?
clean, tell me what you mean. Tell the listeners what you mean by clean.
I'd say, less toxic environment, less
Right.
chemicals, no glyphosate, right?
What's
Which is a big
glyphosate? Yeah.
Glyphosate is basically Roundup, right? And it's what we use all over the place in agriculture, and it's used also to kind of flash dry wheat crops harvesting. So your wheat.
Wait, glyphosate is used to flash straight?
Yeah, kind of like
dry? Oh gosh.
Kind of flash dry it. Yeah.
That's scary.
It is scary. So yeah, any wheat that you eat in the US is typically loaded with that stuff, right?
Ooh.
So my best educated guess was, okay, gluten over there seems to be okay for you. Gluten over here, bad, right? What's the difference? Well, there are other variables that were tipping the scales. Like, we all have our thresholds for tolerance in terms of toxicity and immune response. So she was coming back over here and just the wheels were falling off the bus. So we did an experiment. When she went home, she just went back to her normal way of eating, wheat and everything. She was perfectly fine. And then a month before returning back to the US, she went through the month detox that I'd done with her before, shifted back to a paleo diet, kind of preparing herself for coming back to the US. And then when she gets here, she maintains that paleo diet. And then 1 week out of every month does a detox round. And she's able to keep all of those symptoms at bay. Now, I personally would love it if she would just be gluten-free forever, right? Because it's an obvious problem for her body.
Yeah.
But we were able to develop a lifestyle for her that allowed her to still take advantage of the fact that everything's fine back in her home country, right? So why be miserable, in her mind, on a gluten-free diet back there when it's kind of a big part of the culture and the family? And just kind of prepare herself for coming into this more toxic environment and develop a protocol that she can maintain while she's here for 6 months that keeps her symptom free. So it was just a very, very cool experience that I found personally quite illuminating about the country in which we live.
Right.
How powerful that is. And in fact, I had another FDN practitioner that I was consulting with who had a very similar story about one of his clients who moved from Germany to here like 10 years ago. And as soon as she moved here, her health just deteriorated.
Right.
She was in perfect health in Germany, and then everything happened to her here. It's like, and he's like, what do you think the problem is? I'm like, well, maybe it's she needs to move back to Germany. I mean, I don't know.
I honestly, I'm in a boat where I've had a lot of friends travel to Italy or other places in Europe, and they'd say like magically I can eat cheese and magically I can eat wheat and stuff. And there's kind of been this mysticism of like, is it just in our heads? Is it because we're on vacation and less stressed, or are they really probably pouring less toxins? I mean, America is very liberal with what we do, and we have fewer regulations than other countries. I actually visited Switzerland when I was in high school, and I remember it was the time of year where they put manure on all of the grass, like real manure. And so like we get down into the valley, and it's like you're driving, and you can't even see a farm, but it's like whoosh, just all the manure everywhere. And it's just super natural, at least there in Switzerland where we were at. So not fertilizer. They chose the smelly route.
Yeah.
So, I mean, super interesting. And with that client, I want to backtrack. Like that client's main thing, and I mean, it sounds like it was intense, but the main thing was skin, right?
Yes.
Skin.
Very, very
eczema.
common. Yeah, very common with gluten sensitivity that it manifests in the skin.
You've also said that with gluten sensitivity, it really affects the neural health as well, right? Which I've heard a little bit, but tell us more about that real quick.
Yeah, in fact, even though we associate gluten sensitivity with like GI distress, it affects neurological tissue more than it does gut tissue, statistically.
Statistically, okay.
Yeah. So if you think about things like depression, anxiety, migraines, panic attacks, various mental health diagnoses, dementia, things like that, all of those things. And then, of course, you have your neurological autoimmunity like multiple sclerosis, right? Gluten ataxia, things that affect the nervous system.
What's gluten ataxia, real quick?
Where gluten attacks a part of the brain that controls movement and balance. Mm-hmm. And so people with gluten ataxia start getting, they get something like drop foot maybe, and then they have difficulties maintaining balance and really putting one foot in front of the other. Proprioception goes off, like not really aware of where they are in space sometimes, where their body is in space. And so they're
super
far
interesting.
less
Yeah.
stable. Yeah, really, really interesting. So, but it makes a lot of sense because so many different parts of the wheat protein have kind of this affinity for neurological tissue.
Huh.
And there's molecular mimicry, and then blood-brain barrier issues. And so, there's just this connection between the gut and the brain anyway. So it makes sense to me that gluten sensitivity would show up in the brain just as much, if not more, than in the gut.
Wow. So right now I'm feeling, you've actually encouraged me to get my gluten check because I have a family history. I know. Well, and I'll even tell the listener, like, I have a big family history of a lot of mental health problems, and we've been vigilant, like getting counseling and like getting medication and like even considering bringing in spiritual practices and just trying to be like whole person about our mental health. And yet like just feeling like you're always like behind the ball and just like, okay, I just feel crappy today. And so, I'm going to check it out, if anything, for my kids, because I, have a higher likelihood if I have that, like, I don't want them to. I've always had a mysterious, like, I was diagnosed with anxiety and depression in 6th grade. And when it was diagnosed in 6th grade, I had this aha moment of, first off, I thought everyone felt that way. Like, right? And then, because as a kid, you just don't know any better. And then second off, I was like, oh, I felt this way for almost forever. And so, I haven't checked it out, so I can't tell any results on here, but I'm sure I'll share it on the podcast in the future. Listeners, watch out.
Yeah, that'd be awesome.
I know. The other thing that I feel like I've had an aha is I admittedly, for being a health person, have been reluctant to go organic. I feel so ashamed to say that. That's podcasts are for realness. This is getting raw. I'm just hesitant. And so even hearing you say like they dry the wheat with a toxin, like that Roundup, because Roundup is like we put it on our grass, right? It's even available on for lawns, like, right?
Yeah. Glyphosate is one of the main ingredients, I guess. In Roundup.
And here's something that I know that I learned a while ago, but I don't know if you've actually studied or heard any of this, Whitney, but when they look at where a majority of like runoff of toxins come from, it is not from industry. It's actually from homes, because they make our fertilizer, for example, or our insecticide so strong, so we get the perfect lawn, but it's 10 times what we need. And when I was studying this in a biology and geology, I was studying 2 courses, and they were looking at this. I was actually in the Black Hills studying it specifically. They were saying that it's a little bit more regulated for our when you're a big industry like farming corn, but it's all these like little homes, all these suburbs that are like going crazy. So I personally I was like personally saying like, I'm just not going to use this stuff. My lawn is going to look how it's going to look, but I feel like I'm poisoning my neighbor and my grandchildren by using it if they're saying it's worse for the non-industry use.
That's so fascinating.
Have you ever heard that?
I hadn't heard that, but what I did hear is that golf courses are more toxic than your average commercial agricultural.
Okay. And I believe that.
So that makes sense, because they're doing the same thing. They want these pristine lawns, right? And they have to keep it just so. So yeah, that would make sense.
Right.
But, wow.
Yeah, just a food for thought for, and if anything for listeners, like if you fertilize your lawn, like consider, I know that I don't have a lawn yet, but like I know that there are like organic options and there's more gentle stuff. So definitely something we can even consider, even just for not food we put in our body. Well,
exactly.
Whitney, it's just been so fun talking to you, like gluten expert, just super interesting. It's way more than just like avoiding wheat. Do you have any resources available that you can share with our listeners so they can benefit from all your knowledge?
Sure. In fact, on my website at morgannutrition.com, or at my link tree, which we'll put the link
in the show notes.
Yeah. I have a couple of free handouts. One is a checklist for what you got to think about to establish a gluten-free house, because it's not just about the food. And then the other freebie is it's a coping guide for people with gluten-related disorders, because it really is, there's very few diseases out there that require a treatment that is 24/7 and that impacts how you socialize with other people, right? So people that have to give up gluten go through a very unique emotional roller coaster and a sense of isolation.
Yeah. Yes. You dressed that,
quite
girl.
a journey.
I love that.
Yeah. So this is a great handout for people going through it and for people who are trying to support people going through it. Because I talk about how you can support other people, maybe things not to say, right? Or not to do, advice not to give.
My heart is wrenching right now. Like, Whitney, I have to admit, when I hear someone say they're a gluten expert, and I know you have high belief in what you do, I also get this feeling that it's just going to be like this really intense, like, oh, why aren't you gluten-free? Kind of judgmental, right. But like, that's a beautiful resource. And clearly you'd be able to walk anyone through that if they were working with you as well. Like, and that's a free resource that you just have.
That's a free resource. Yeah.
Okay.
And you're right, Allison. That's most of what I do is walking people through those really hard things, like the conversations with their family members to try to get some support. And it can be hard. It can be really hard.
The details are like, okay, sure, cut this thing out, don't buy this. Like that's almost black and white, but it's all those like relational stuff. And I mean, that is 100% I feel like most of the time when I'm talking with someone about their health, they're like, I want to get better, but I don't know what it's going to do, like how hard it will be to either my willpower or even like how my spouse will respond, how my parents will respond, what support I can get. So even that can help people. Well, I'm going to go download that. I'm curious what you have to say. I want to support, just all the ways we can support people who are going through diet changes. So, so beautiful. And then where can we find you online, Whitney?
Yeah, so my website is morgannutrition.com. I'm on Facebook under Morgan Nutrition, Instagram, Morgan Nutrition 24. And then you can find me on YouTube, just Whitney Morgan channel. Yeah. So
what also, I knew you were on YouTube, or you mentioned it. What type of things? Is it just like you just talk about like tips and tricks? I haven't seen any of your videos.
Yeah, basically I do an IGTV video that I upload to YouTube every week. And I talk about different things. I spent, I have 4 videos just on that coping, the coping cycle that people with gluten-related disorders go through. I talk about gluten-free house. I talk about gluten sensitivity and how it's connected to other health issues, whether it's rheumatoid arthritis or ADHD and autism, or so those kinds of things. The one I just did for tomorrow is about 3 things to eliminate from your diet. So I kind of go all over the place, but everything always for me kind of comes back to gluten. So
guys, go check out Whitney Morgan. I mean, that sounds like a phenomenal YouTube, phenomenal Instagram. Follow her, get her tips. And I'm sure that some of our listeners will want to work with you further, or at least, how could they, if someone wants to actually get your brain on their body, how could they work with you further?
Well, if you go to my website, you can set up a qualifying call with me. It's free. It's 20 minutes. I take 3 private clients a month. So I just kind of interview folks and we see if we're a good fit. But if they just want to kind of dabble their toes in the water, the mini course that I developed, which is called the Gluten Gauntlet mini course, and it's 5 weeks to a gluten-free house. If they just want to get a sense of me and what it would be like to work with me, then check out my course. And
awesome. How much is that course? And I know you are offering a special, what do we call that?
Promotion.
Yeah, they're getting it for less. So what is it normally and how much are they getting off?
Sure, it's $127 and it's a 5 module course. You can do it at your own pace. You can binge it. You can do it over 5 weeks. For your audience, they're going to get $30 off if they use the promotional code BELLY30. All caps.
I mean, that puts it almost right at like 100. So I feel like that's getting a lot. I am so interested in what is in your course. And
well, you know what's really cool about it, Allison, is that the course is designed so that every lesson they get to answer questions, they get to ask me questions, they get to fill out forms at the end of each lesson and to tell me what they're struggling with. And I read every single question and I respond personally. So it is a way for them to get their hand held a little bit and to see if they do have a rapport with me, right? If we would be a good fit.
Before doing testing and all that.
Yeah,
so.
Before paying the big bucks and like jumping all in, right?
Right. But those big bucks are worth it. I know
it.
So.
Oh yeah. It's the last big bucks you'll ever have to spend.
Oh, that's a good way. Oh, girl, I'm gonna the last big. That's good. Well, Whitney, thank you so much for being on here. You are my gluten expert. Like, I mean, it's just so beautiful being a gut health expert and like loving what I do and knowing I've helped people, but just knowing if there's other people out there who just need the next level in specifically gluten, or they've got all these autoimmune and they're suspicious. Like you are just, it's such a wealth that you've been on here and they now are connected to you. So thank you so much, Whitney.
Thank you for having me, Allison. It's been so much fun, and I hope we get to chat again.
Yes, we will, I'm sure.
Okay, awesome.
Was Whitney's story amazing or what? I would not just have anyone onto this podcast to talk about gluten. Going gluten-free is not for everyone, and it is not a cure-all for gut health. I love how Whitney brought a nuanced understanding of how you can miss a celiac disease or wheat sensitivity diagnosis, and that even if you do have a gluten sensitivity or allergy, going gluten-free is not a cure-all for gut health. It takes a lot more, a lot of thought, and a little bit of time just to let your gut heal. If you want to talk with Whitney more about going gluten-free, you can check her out on Instagram at Morgan Nutrition 24, following the link down in the show notes, or you can go to her Gluten Gauntlet mini course available in the show notes below. You can use the code BELLY30 for $30 off this course, which it's normally $127 as of November 2020, but with the code BELLY30, you'll get this amazing 5-week course to go gluten-free in your household for just $97. It's an amazing deal, and it is only available until December 10th, 2020. That is 3 weeks from today. And I would strongly recommend checking it out if going gluten-free is something you have been considering. Another way that you can connect with Whitney is by scheduling a free 20-minute qualifying call with her to see if one-to-one coaching is right for you. You can follow the link in the show notes, and I'm sure she'd love to talk with you. Well, if you love this episode, we have even more coming down the line. I encourage you to subscribe so you can catch all of our episodes. And if you listen to this episode and were thinking about that one friend, I encourage you, take a screenshot of the episode and just text to that friend. I cannot count how many times I tell someone I'm a gut health specialist that they say, I know someone who needs you. So send that friend a love note to their gut and do us a favor and pass this podcast along. Or if you don't have anybody to share this with, if you could leave us a rating and review, I would be so grateful for your words. It really helps other people just like you to find this podcast and find all the tips and tricks to help them have a better gut and a better life. Other ways you can stay connected in the conversation is by following us on Instagram and Facebook at Better Belly Therapies. We love connecting with our listeners, and it means so much if you drop by and said hi. And lastly, just a reminder about my favorite quote and a reminder for your own body. Miracles are immediate. Healing takes time.